With God, there is always more. More love, more life, more freedom. Welcome to Zoe's Exploring More with Michael Thompson. C.S. Lewis once wrote, "Our Heavenly Father has provided many delightful inns for us along our journey, but He takes great care to see that we do not mistake any of them for home." Join me and the team as we explore the kingdom together, discovering the deep truths and offering encouragement for the journey. There is always more.
Hey there, Exploring More podcast listeners. Welcome to the podcast. It's S.J. Jennings, and I'm here with my friends Gary Barkalow and Jim Cheney. And we are going to continue a conversation that we started last week when we talked about the stages of the masculine journey. And I'm really thrilled to be here with Jim and Gary, a couple of guys that I would consider sages and great influence and mentors in my life. So I'm really, really glad to be back with you, Gary, and to have you on, Jim, today.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah, man. So just as a quick recap, we talked in the last podcast about the different stages of the masculine journey: boyhood, the ranger, the warrior, lover, the king, and then finally the sage. We kind of gave an overview of those different stages. And this morning, we want to talk about the sage stage in particular. I hope I can continue to say that and have it make sense without stumbling on sage stage. It's
good job so far.
Yeah, thanks, man. So it's my understanding that the sage stage really begins around the age of 60, but it's not just a role you step into, like, you know, when you become a father, you're in the role of dad, right? It's more gradual than that, I would imagine. And what are some of the indicators that you're entering into that stage? It's not just chronological, right?
You know, I think 60 is probably a fair age if you have to draw a line with ages. But I think it's a place in your life where there is a little bit more settledness. There is a little bit more of the ability to be able to go where what God has given you is needed versus, no, I'm here, I cannot move from this place, this consumes me. I just think there's a freedom, a different type of freedom that comes at this point of the sage stage, if you will. The one quote we're all familiar with, to me, which is such a sage kind of a quote, is the Winston Churchill one that he's very famous for. So he becomes a prime minister, World War II is upon them, and the quote goes like this. He said, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, that all of my past life had been but a preparation for this hour." He was in his 60s at this point, but there was something about that where a man comes to the point and they realize that all of these things in my life have brought me now to this hour, and I am needed. I know what it is that I bring. That to me just feels like a quote from someone who is very much a sage.
I think one of the keys in that quote is his understanding of how his background got him there, his understanding of what stage he's in. I think that's part of it. I've heard it described that a sage stage is a person with a certain wisdom. And I think that wisdom comes from a combination of experience, which takes time and years, and that's why we're saying 60 or above, although that's like every other stage, there's a lot of overlap. But the wisdom has to be combined with a certain amount of reflection, a certain amount of walking with God in the experiences to understand them and the meaning of them. I think, to me, one of the keys for a stage is having a pretty clear true north, pretty clear rudder, understanding what's important and what's been important in your life and being willing to share it. And I don't mean that you're closed-minded about what's important. You're certainly compassionate to other people's ideas, but you have as you said, Gary, a settledness about what you feel is important in life.
Mm-hmm. Kind of in that vein, there's a part of this description of the sage stage that I have here in front of me that says, what a man has based his life on will most significantly be exposed during this stage. Also, what is still the broken places of the sage's heart will most often be revealed during this time. Mm-hmm. So the way that you guys just described the wisdom accumulated through life with the Churchill quote that you utilized there, Gary, have you found that to be true? Have you found it to be the case that when you get to this stage, as you said, Gary, there's a little more freedom, you're maybe released from, maybe you're in retirement, or maybe your kids are adults now and there's less responsibility there, that kind of thing. There's maybe some more freedom to explore the parts of your heart that you've maybe had to put on hold for a little while so that you can further develop that wisdom that you would bring as you described it. Have you found that to be true?
I'm finding it more and more true. One advantage, we said that the stages overlap. One advantage to the sage stage is there's no stage after it to overlap, which puts a little bit more urgency into the reflection and understanding part of it, and the importance of what was that all about, and why was that important, and how was God working in that, that kind of reflection.
And I think it is true. As you get older, you will become more of what you were. So the idea of understanding the stages and going back and letting God redeem some of those things that were missing, or the things that were part of your life that shouldn't have been, is so important, because when I was born, my mother was 42. So most of my years with my parents were in their older years, into their retirement. And I remember going to an assisted living community they lived in. I'd go over every day to go see them. I saw these men who would be sitting in a chair all by themselves every day, every day, every day. And they were talking to themselves. No one was with them. And I would think, why aren't there kids here around them? And the more I would listen to what they were saying as I was walking through, I thought, oh, I know why they're not here. I couldn't be around that for more than 5 minutes. And I thought, yeah, if they were bitter before and they became more bitter. They were angry before, they became more angry.
Wow.
And I started thinking, this is why every year is important. What are you doing with it? What is God doing? Because you're going to become more of that. It's just what happens. The other thing that, Jim, you mentioned, I had a mentor sage in my life, and he said, Gary, we do not learn from experience. Otherwise, we'd all be very wise by the time we hit our later years. He said, we only learn by evaluated experience. You go through experiences and you evaluate it. What did I learn from that? Why did that happen? What does that show me about me, about God? What do I take to God? And so I think there are many people that have years of experience, but very little wisdom or kindness or humility. And there are those who spent their life evaluating their experiences with God and with others, and now they have a life of wisdom and humility and kindness.
And that ties in so beautifully to what we say over and over at our conferences, and that is, if you have a question, walk with God in it. And this is what the sage stage is all about, the understanding of the experiences you've had because you have walked with God in those experiences, or have gone back to those experiences with God and examined them or redeemed them.
Allowed him to redeem those experiences for your past, sure. As you look back through your past, through your life, do you see moments of, for lack of a better term, sageness? Do you have maybe a story where you started to realize that you were in that stage? You really are becoming that. I think there's a reverence and a weightiness assigned to each of the stages and each of the roles that we go through in life, but to the sage stage in particular, I think there's a weightiness assigned to that, and that comes along with it. And what can tend to rise up in some of us is, myself included in the different stages I've been in, is sort of this, I don't know if I'd go so far as to call it false humility, right? But this, my first response is to say, really, that's me? You see me that way? You perceive me that way? So as you look back through some of your experiences, can you share a time where, you really knew you were in a position to help someone else evaluate their experience, like you said, Gary, or some other example where you just kind of knew you were in that stage?
The first thought that comes to my mind is a situation that happened a couple of years ago, not where I said anything wise or brilliant or sagely, but where there was a man with me who I had been meeting with for 3 or 4 years every week, who opened up to me about something in his life. And then at the end of that, he said, I've never shared that with anybody. And I said, well, you've shared it with your wife, right? And he said, no, I've never shared that with anybody. So in a sense, being able to build that kind of trust with another human being and being on the receiving end of their growth, or being part of it in a very subtle way, is one of the really cool things about this stage, I think.
Right. Yeah, that's great.
And that's a fascinating question, SJ. I think for me, what comes up in my heart right away is this idea that there were many years when I would see something that wasn't operating correctly, that could have been done better. And my thought was, just let me have it. I'll fix it. Let me have it. Let me make this right. And now what I'm more motivated by is let me help you. I don't really want to be in that kingly position. I want to help the king do better. I want to help him think through what's going on, ask questions, and just come alongside. And that's very new for me. And I think that's when I first felt this change happen, that I am very little concerned that I have any sort of a title with me anymore. It doesn't feel important to me as it used to. Title will really help me get done what needs to get done. And now I just don't care that much about it anymore. In fact, I like not having one, actually.
I think that's huge. I mean, wouldn't you agree that if you were in a conversation with someone who you were mentoring or being a sage with, that they do most of the talking, that if you were to give percentages to how much they talked, how much you talked, it would be 80-20. They talk 80, I talk 20. It's so being a sage is not spouting your wisdom. It's having a certain wisdom that is almost shared non-verbally in some cases or very sparingly or something.
Yeah, it's your presence really is a huge aspect of it. And not just your presence in terms of being in the room, but the weightiness that you bring into the room and the freedom, like Jim in the story you shared, the man just felt that freedom with you because I believe, knowing you, that there's a settledness about you. You're safe. I don't know if you went through the process of, well, if anything you share with me is going to stay with us or whatever, whatever you
Years
said.
Before.
Maybe, yeah. So anyone that's in this stage has this kind of way about them. It's the old commercial E.F. Hutton, right? When he talks, people listen. And everybody, I think, has encountered that guy that just kind of sits off to the side and doesn't say a word until he does. Right. And everybody's like, whoa, wow, where'd you come up with that?
Yeah.
And I love what you said too about the titles. You want to help the king to be better, and you don't need a title for that. But the title for that position is actually vizier. So there's a royal vizier in that hierarchy, usually an older man, but would be the king's source of wisdom. If he wasn't sure what to do, Gary, I need to decide between this, this, and this. What do you think? And that would be the position that they would hold.
Yeah. Another thing that's been more recent for me, and I find myself using this phrase a lot, the phrase being, I understand, I get it. I think with the accumulation of years, you not only learn how to do something like you might in the warrior and king stage, but I think in the sage stage, you can look back and say, I know what you're going through.
Right.
Not just what you need to do, but I understand what you're feeling, how you're struggling now, the questions you have. I get it. I think that's something about the sage stage as well, as I get it. Let's talk at that level right now of what you're going through. We can talk technique and ideas later, but right now, that's the hardest thing, is how do I handle the struggle of this more than what do I do? And I think as a sage, you know that, and you can come along at that level.
Yeah, that's so good, Gary. The steps that you need to take to resolve an issue or come out of a difficult time or bear up during a struggle, the things you do are not as important. They are important, but what's more important is having the perspective on what's going on right now. And what's being provoked in your heart in that moment, right? And so a sage has the ability to say, okay, we'll get to what your next steps need to be. There's things you're going to need to do, but let's talk about why this is so hard for you.
Right.
Let's talk about what is being provoked in you right now. Yeah, that's so good.
This is a bit of a generalization, but as a king, you tend to solve problems and control things and give kingly advice. And more as a sage, there's more of the realization that God works uniquely with each person, and that advice you gave as a king may not be the advice this particular person needs, and that if you could lead them to the person who does know the answer to their question, if you can help them to seek out God and walk with Him in their issues, then that would be more helpful in the long run than solving their problem for them.
Yeah, you're less interested as you move into the sage stage, it seems, in being the one that has the answers.
Right.
And you're more interested in just helping the person.
Right.
And wherever that help might come from, you might refer them to someone else that could better answer their questions than you could.
A person who's in the king stage, you know they can find an answer to their problem. If it's a methodology, it's a technique, it's a solution, you know they can find it, but you also know that what's more important and that what will really determine the outcome of that answer, method, technique is how that man or woman is doing in their heart, right? How they are doing. Because they can have the right answer, but it could come from the wrong motive or timing or perception. And so it's kind of the understanding of, I know you can find the answer, but I want to talk at a deeper level of how are you doing right now? Because that will determine the quality of the answer and the fruit, if you will.
As a man who's in the king stage right now, Gary, I will tell you that's frustrating for me. Because I'm a guy that just wants to storm the field. I will go in and break all the china in the china shop if that's what you want me to do. I mean, I'm just a doer of a person.
And we need that sometimes.
Yes, sometimes. Yeah. Right. You need a lead blocker, right? But there's a frustrating aspect to that. In my experience and in my personality, I'm trying to learn to wait for things, to consider and listen to all different aspects before moving in a given direction. Maybe that's part of the transition between the stages, right? I think there is, like you mentioned, Jim, there's overlap between the stages. There's overlap between absolutely. Boyhood and Ranger. There's overlap between Ranger and so on. So I'm feeling that in my own experience, a little bit of the overlap where instead of just, rushing the field, let me pause, think about all of the aspects of what would happen if I did that before I do it. Because you're right. And what happens is, in terms of the king always having an answer, yeah, I've got an answer for it. But oftentimes it's a square peg in a round hole kind of an answer. And I got a big hammer that I can jam that square peg in there with. You know? And that's not helpful a lot of times. Yeah.
I love Oswald Chambers. He speaks to me with his devotional, with my utmost, with his highest. And I've gone through that year after year after year. But one of the things that caught me, in fact, it's not in My Utmost for His Heights, it's one of his other books, but he said this. He said, am I getting nobler, better, more helpful, more humble as I get older? Am I exhibiting the life that men take knowledge of as having been with Jesus? Or am I getting more self-assertive, more deliberately determined to have my own way? And then he ends this sentence with, it's a great thing to tell yourself the truth. And I just think this idea of, as I'm getting older, how am I getting? Because it's that idea that you were talking about, Jim, of we will become more of what we are, and therefore what we are has to be important to us right now. We have to pay attention to that.
Whatever stage you're in.
Yeah, and I think as we get older, we really should become men that are more helpful, more noble, more humble versus it's my way or the highway kind of thing. And that's the older man that people avoid.
Right.
And therefore, you can't be a sage to others when people are just avoiding you because it's just painful to be around you,
Well, with that, let's take a short break. And when we come back, what I'd love to talk about a little more specifically, what are the aspects of being a sage and how does the enemy come against being a sage? But we'll talk about that when we come back from the break. Hey, Exploring More podcast listeners, I just wanted to bring your attention to our annual conference called the Heart of a Warrior Encounter. It's our weekend conference initiative designed to take a man into his deep heart and intimate encounters with God. Time away with God is critical to healing, training, becoming more. And our main themes align with material found in John Eldredge's books, Robert Lewis's Men's Fraternity, Neil Anderson's Victory Over the Darkness, and the teachings of C.S. Lewis, Dallas Willard, A.W. Tozer, and other great faculty members of our hearts, all created to take a man further up and further in to the life that God offers. During the weekend, we have three main objectives: help a man get his heart back, teach him how to fight, and show him where the battles are. To see Christ come for a man's heart and what God is up to in validating a man, initiating him, and calling him into the larger story is truly a glorious thing. It is a fierce journey for every man, but one that desperately needs to be taken. I want to encourage you to join the squadrons of men who are hungry and thirsty for more. The kingdom needs more men who know what it is to walk deeply with God. Come with us and be one of the men who is seeking and finding more. Visit www.zoe.org/events for more information about the Heart of a Warrior Encounter. The dates are March 21st through March 24th, Thursday to Sunday, 2019, and we hope you'll join us. Hope we'll see you there. Welcome back, listeners. I'm here with Gary and Jim, and we are talking about the sage stage of masculinity. And Gary just shared a quote right before the break from Oswald Chambers. And as we were in the break, we're sitting here going, man, I need to read that every day. That needs to be on my mirror, right, as I'm shaving or whatever. But can you just read that one more time before we continue on? Because I think it's important to reiterate what Oswald is saying there.
Yeah, this is what he wrote. Am I getting nobler, better, more helpful, more humble as I get older? Am I exhibiting the life that men take knowledge of as having been with Jesus? Or am I simply getting more self-assertive, more deliberately determined to have my own way? It is a great thing to tell yourself the truth.
Wow. Okay. So I feel like we could just sit in that for a minute. It's a great thing to tell yourself the truth. So are we telling the truth about ourselves? Yeah.
And are we allowing others to tell us the truth about ourselves? Because when you look at this, it's hard to self-determine this. But to ask somebody, which am I becoming more of in my life, I think is so important, because again, being deceived about who you really are, the very nature of deception is you don't know it. What an important thing to ask others, your spouse and close friends. Where do you see me in this? What direction am I facing?
Yeah. I was listening to another podcast recently. Self-examination was the topic. And one of the questions that this gentleman suggested that you would ask another trusted individual would be, what do you know about me that I don't know, but I should?
Wow.
Yeah, so along the lines of what you just described, that's a brave question to ask, right?
And hopefully we are asking that question and being answered throughout these other stages, particularly the warrior stage and the king stage. So it's just these kind of things in our life, I believe, at least in my life, the humility, the kindness, the helpfulness. I can't get on a 1-month program and make that happen. It's been accumulating one direction or another all of these years, hopefully.
And another thing that we talk about a lot is this false self, real self, true self dichotomy. And as you get older, as you grow more into the sage stage, hopefully you are becoming more the true self and less of the false self.
Right.
I mean, that's huge. So because you could be doing the things that you talked about doing, but as you said earlier, what's the motivation for doing them? It's almost like, religiosity. You could be worshiping and singing praises to God at church, but you're doing it because you've always done it or that's what everybody else is doing and not because it's coming from your heart. Is that the real you or is that the put on you for the Sunday morning service you?
Right.
And the sage is more and more real. And I think that's what, as you said earlier, Scott, that's what people see and like.
So as you're sharing that, Jim, I mean, the freedom that we've described as part of this stage of being a sage, does that allow you to cast off the false self more readily? Have you experienced that? Have you been more willing and maybe even able when someone points out the false self in you or some kind of a behavioral pattern that they see? Are you willing to say, yeah, you're right, that is my false self, and just let go of it? I mean, it feels like to me it's harder as you're younger to let go of that because it works for you, right? But as you get older and deeper into these stages, is it easier to let go of some of that?
What's happening for me, and I hope it continues to be true, is I'm developing less of a taste for the false self. It's becoming more disgusting to me. Now, not that I don't dip in and use the false self and tempted to and can make certain things work, but honestly, when I do that, I get more of a sour taste in my mouth of, that's so not the man I want to be. I'm more aware of it now. It's not as useful to me now, thank God, and I mean that, as it used to be. If it's easier to walk away from, I don't know if I would say that as much as it's more distasteful to me when I experience it. I'm more alert to the words I just used. That's not really me, that I was manipulating them. I was trying to accomplish something for myself that really is distasteful to me now, more than it was before.
That's good. As we glide in towards landing the plane on this discussion, I want to ask you guys, how have you experienced the enemy coming against you in this stage? What does that look like for you?
Well, part of it has to be in that overlap part as you're getting into the stage, the uncertainty of it. We talked about 60 years old is such an arbitrary number. But in my early 60s, when someone would say, well, you should be a sage, again, it goes back to having that true north and that clear set of principles and values, which are, for a Christian, are putting God first, understanding that he created us for intimacy, oneness, and connectedness, all that stuff. But it's also understanding, Gary, you talk a lot about glory, understanding the small g glory that God has given each of us, the uniqueness and the giftedness and the talentedness, that it's okay. It's okay to live in that glory. It's good to live in that glory. And it's a little bit of a battle because you're trying to get away from the self-centeredness of some of those earlier stages and go to an other-centeredness, but still bring your small g glory. And then the enemy would love to get in there and say, there you go again, bragging or solving problems or doing this or doing that. And I can't do this sage thing. And just, all the typical enemy stuff that happens. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
No, it does. It does. You described it a little bit there. I want to hear from you on this topic, Gary, and then I got a follow-up question for both of you.
Jim, that's so good. The enemy coming back and saying, so you think you're all that. On the other hand, he plays this line of, so you really are nothing. You don't have anything. You're unneeded. No one wants to hear from you. The best thing you could do is get out of the younger men's way. I feel both of those things in my life. When Paul said in 2 Corinthians 4:16-18, this is so much the attack, I think, on a man coming in the later years of his life, a man or woman, really. He said, therefore, do not lose heart, though outwardly we are wasting away, yet inwardly we are being renewed day by day. For the light and momentary troubles we are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary and what is unseen is eternal. There is a true feeling of wasting away. I'm very aware of the strength I don't have that I used to have. I'm not what I used to be. I feel that very much. Yeah, physically. Yeah. And I have to go back to, Paul said, but inwardly, the new man is being renewed day by day. There is something that is becoming stronger on the inside, and I have to hold on to that. And of course, the world says, look on the outside. How are you doing physically? How are you doing corporately in the work world? So there's the battle of, I got to hold on to, I have more now than I did as a younger man, and it's needed. And not hold on to title, position, those things, because those do fade. They just go away no matter what. They are going to change. So Michael has used the term, so many times we can feel kicked to the curb by society. And I think as I get older, I can feel kicked to the curb, right? You don't know what we know today. You're really in the way. You're old-fashioned and holding on to the fact that God says, no, actually, I have given you wisdom through years, hopefully wisdom of walking with God, not with the world, and holding on to that and saying, I do have something. Actually, the only way I can believe that is if I believe that what God has given me is for others. Then I can hold on to that and say, I believe it and I want to offer it. But if I think what I have received is all for me, then that taste of pride is so distasteful, I want to spit that out.
I think it all goes back to what we talked about earlier and having a clear understanding of what's truly important. Is it truly important that you're getting a lot of calls from customers or friends asking for advice? Or is it truly important that you can solve a computer problem or some kind of social media thing that I know very little about? Is that important? Or is understanding who Jesus is and who we are to him important? And can you, in that confidence, can you live as a sage with that kind of confidence?
Right. As you grow further and further into the stage, what I'm hearing from you guys is that it's more and more outwardly focused. You're less and less concerned about not necessarily the development of your own heart, because we're never really done doing that. But as you said, Gary, you're done with self-promotion. You're done with, so many aspects of this false self that we talk about. You're just kind of done with that, and there's a distaste or a disdain for it. I'm not going to go there because I've experienced that so much throughout my life. I'm done with it, right? But the false self we know is still kind of lurking around. So what have you experienced? How have you seen the false self work in this stage of your life? Is it really any different from the other stages, or is it the same old routine?
It feels like the same routine for me. It's the same false self, right, that has been offered to me and that I've built on for years and dipped in and out of. So I think when I'm feeling like I need you to validate me, I need you to tell me I'm somebody that I'm needed, I can jump into this. It may sound different now than it did 10 years ago, but I can jump into, by the way, did I tell you all the things that I've done in my life? Have I told you all the people I've led or the things that I've built? And now I'm finding, and I hope it's more and more true, that as that starts to work in my mind, that motivation comes up, I catch it earlier. And like I said, it's almost nauseating before I get it out of my mouth, But my false self is pretty much the same. Just hopefully I'm catching it before it rises up.
I think that's pretty universal. And I know I deal with that same thing. We all do. The constant need for approval and attention. And you're doing it well, Jim. Keep it up.
Here are the things that I see that I feel that want to energize the false self. It wants me to choose that life instead of who I really am. And honestly, I think we get older, we are more tempted by having the sensation, the feelings of hopelessness. We honestly know as we get older, we can see the clock at some point is going to stop. It's being in the fourth quarter. You know that the 2-minute warning is coming. And when the 2-minute warning comes, you know you have 2 more minutes. I mean, you have to understand there is an end to the game. And you have to know how to manage the clock, but it is manageable. So hopelessness is one. I think another one is this feeling of no one needs me, because as we leave our positions, it's outlined for us. We're paid for it. We're evaluated on it. Now, as that starts to change, it feels like, so do I have a position? And no one's telling me if I'm doing well in it or not. It's just this lostness of, am I needed? Am I significant? Do I have a place here? And a common thing I've heard from so many older men is, as we get into their story and they start to reveal their heart, where they're at presently, they'll say to me, I didn't think life would look like it does right now. And there's a lot of sadness in that and hopelessness for them.
Yeah, because that can go either way, right? I mean, that can be a positive thing.
Oh,
right?
exactly.
But your experience has been it's mostly
sad because the false self has built an image of what they are to look like.
Right.
Until they come back and they start, as you said, Jim, recognizing the God-given glory or weightiness or splendor or brilliance of their life that God has been multiplying, and now it's time to give. Then they can say, I get it. I get what my life is to look like now, and that's exciting. But if it's been built on, position, status, pay, it will look hopeless because you're going to lose those things.
All that's going to go away. Right. Sure. Okay, so as we land the plane, can you guys think of an experience you had with a sage? Not as a sage, but with a sage, when someone was a sage for you. And can you just describe that experience? What does that look like? Or what did that look like for you?
I've talked about a situation where one of my good brothers, who's also a contractor, was over at my house, and my wife and I were talking to him about doing some work. And I was probably dominating the conversation and maybe cut my wife off a few times and didn't realize it. And after that conversation, an hour or two later, I got a phone call from him saying, hey, Jim, let's get together tomorrow with Michael and I would like to talk to you. So, I'm always excited about getting together with my good brothers and sharing good stories. And so we got together and they said, we'd love to talk to you about that meeting yesterday and how you kind of cut your wife off and didn't show respect for her. Tell us what you were thinking there. And so it was kind of a rebuke, but it was a needed rebuke. And, I'm not sure that it's the sagely manner that we've been talking about in terms of listening and loving. I mean, it was, but it was also a rebuke that was needed at the time that I didn't see. I did not see that during that conversation the previous day. It took them bringing it up for me to go back and experience it and realize that they were right.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's part of the freedom that we've described in the sage stage of life. You might, in earlier stages, be more hesitant to confront someone in that manner. But as a sage, you've got that freedom of, okay, I love this individual. I love this guy. He's a brother, and I'm seeing something in his life that he is obviously overlooking or missing, or he's denying that exists in his life. And I'm willing to risk my relational capital with him to help him become a fuller expression of himself.
Yeah. 2 stories I think of is one, I had a sagely man in my life, a dear friend, and this man was 10 years ahead of me. And we were together with some friends, and evidently I was pretty quick to give some advice, to give this man my perspective that I thought he should have. And later, this friend, this sage in my life, pulled me aside as you were describing your situation and just said, Gary, I don't think you knew enough of this man's life, his heart, to actually be giving advice. You may have advice, that's true, but you don't know his story. So I would just encourage you, get to know the man, ask questions before you come to a conclusion. And it was a rebuke, but it was one I needed. I really admired it. It stung, but it was good.
It's powerful.
And I've not forgotten it. Sometimes the things we remember the most are the things that come with pain, and I've not forgotten that. And another story, a different man in my life, we were speaking together. Gosh, this was decades and decades ago, and he was probably 15 years ahead of me. And I remember I was speaking to this group first. And as I was speaking, I was watching the men, most of whom were older than me. I was watching them. I could tell they weren't really engaging with me. Many were being polite with me, but I could tell it was not landing with them. And I felt terrible. I felt that I let my mentor down, my sage down. And I remember he spoke after me. There's a short break, and then he spoke. And I mean, it was a different room. I could see these men. They were engaged. They were sitting up. They were taking it in. They were connecting. He was connecting with them. And that night, I went to him and I said, I am so sorry. I have disappointed you. I've done this wrong. If you ask me never to speak with you again, I absolutely understand this. And he said, Gary, he said, you have to understand something. He said, you are speaking to these men as a 40-year-old, and therefore you're going to have a 40-year-old's effect on them. And that's fine. You be a 40-year-old. Do not try to be a 55-year-old. He was 55, and he said, I will have a different effect than you. So you be who you are, I'll be who I am. You have nothing to apologize for, unless you're trying to be me. Then you have something to apologize for.
Wow.
And I have never forgotten that. To be the true self, to be the man I am, don't try to be someone else. And that was such sagely advice, and I'd never forgotten it.
Wow. Wow. That's a great story.
Scott, I think one of the sad things is that we don't have a lot of stories of great sages. There haven't been, in my life anyway, there haven't been a lot of great sages. I'm not sure if it's because I haven't sought them out or let them in or what, but it's pretty rare. And that's why maybe this conversation is so important.
Mm-hmm.
As we've said many times, you don't just jump into sagehood. So you guys that are still warriors or kings or lovers, or hopefully we're all some of that. But what you're going through now, whatever you're going through now, is preparation for the next stage. Stay with it. Analyze it, think about it, was a word we used earlier, reflect on it, because that's all important stuff.
Yeah. And Jim, what's so good that I'm reminded as you say that is that this one mentor of mine said, he said, the problem is older men who are sagely, have so much to give to a younger man, they don't think that younger men want anything from them. And then you have younger men who really think that an older man does not want to spend time with me the rest of my life.
Right.
So he said, therefore, you have the standoff. Older men aren't offering, younger men aren't asking.
Amen.
My advice to everyone is younger men, ask. Ask another man, would you meet with me? And don't make it, would you meet with me for the next year? Because there's an older man that may say, okay, I don't know if I can commit to that. Just say, can we get together and have coffee and talk?
Yeah.
And then ask for more. And older men, do the same thing. Just don't come in and say, I want to mentor you. Simply say, let's get together.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk and hear about your life.
Amen.
I thought, boy, he hit a reality that I have experienced as a younger man, thinking that an older man would not want to spend time with me. And as an older man, I'm thinking, I don't know if a younger man wants anything from me or if I have anything to offer. So again, that was sagely advice given to me that I've held on to.
That's great.
Yeah. And so it occurs to me that if you're a listener and you are in this stage of life and you're thinking, you're looking around, man, I don't have anybody that wants my wisdom or wants to talk to me. As a younger man, I'm 48 and have been walking this message since I was about 36, 37 years old. I am thirsty for it. I'm thirsty for having sages in my life. And so if you're a sage and you're not sure, whether or not a younger man wants to talk to you, they do. Mm-hmm. So put yourself in positions where you can interact with them, whether that's at, in a church setting or wherever it might, go to the local gun club or down to the gym or whatever it might be, right? And put yourself in a position where you could potentially have those relationships. And I would say to the younger guys who are listening, who are hungry for this, as a younger guy, first of all, put aside the false self that tells you you got it all figured out, because we know that's not true, no matter who you are, and embrace this idea that these men want to love you. They're on the same road you're on. They're just a little further along it, right? So they've got so much wisdom to impart. So you seek them out as a younger man. Go up to the sage that you know and say to him, hey, man, can we just go get a cup of coffee, like you said, Gary? Gary, as we kind of wrap up this podcast, can you talk a little bit about your fourth quarter events and what the motivation behind that was and how guys can find out more about them?
SJ, I have just seen, Jim, it's just like you have, I have seen so many older men that have walked with God over the years, have fought many battles, and have lost some but won many. And I've watched these men pull back in their life. For whatever reason, whatever they're hearing, they have pulled back, they have stopped offering, and my heart goes out for them because I know what they're feeling, I know what they're struggling with, and to be able to get these men together and say, let's just talk. Because the fact is, this is to be the most powerful time in your life. And I'm not talking in terms that you often hear from the church, right? This is a time when you can give more. This is a time when you can simply volunteer more, for Sunday school classrooms or childcare. We're talking far beyond that, that this should be a time of extravagant giving of who you are, and also to be very selective. As an older man who has possibly more time and more resources, what's typical is you're asked far more now to give of something in your life than you were before. And it's easy to say yes to anything because you don't know the one thing you're supposed to be giving. And to be able to say, we need to figure out what is that one thing that God has given you. And he's saying, that's what you need to give. That's the one thing that no one else can give like you do. And to give that, and you're probably going to say no to a lot of other things, but this is the thing, and offer it extravagantly, generously, and without apology. Now, you can only do that well if you're a man, as Oswald Chambers said, who does it in a helpful way, in a kindly way, and in humility. And so I've been wanting to get these men together to say, let's just talk about what life is really like for you now. It's not as unique as you think because I suffer from what you suffer from. I feel it. I have to fight through it. And so recognize, what does it mean to be a sage? What does it mean to live in the fourth quarter? Again, the clock is ticking. You have to manage the clock. No holes barred right now. If you got trick plays, it's time to use them. This is a time when you pull out. It's not a time for the rookies. It's time for the experienced players, and that's what you are, because this is when the game is won, right here. This is what we go through. What does your life feel like right now? What are your battles? What is it you've been given by God to give to others? How do you recognize it? And this, as in any stage, cannot be done alone, ever.
No.
Earlier stages, we really needed those who were ahead of us to walk with, and we need brothers. The older we get, the more our only option are brothers, right? Those ahead have gone on to be with Jesus, But this idea, especially of brotherhood, when everything in our life feels like it's isolating us from brothers and from others. So I just see the immense need of sages, as we're using that term right now, in this world. It's always been true, but we need it now. So how do sages be called out and brought forward when often, sadly enough, in the church, that is not happening? I had one man say, I feel like what I hear from my church is, how you will help me is don't grumble and give all you can to this church.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, wow, I think I've heard that before. Never in those words, but that feeling. And I'm saying it's time to call the sages up.
Right.
And in.
Yeah, it's almost like the message is just sit to the side and rust away.
Right.
Rather than wear out, right? I mean, I want to be worn out.
Yep.
I've heard the term, there's no such thing as retirement, it's refirement. We're getting refired.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
Yep.
And I love that you're doing this, Gary, because we need this so much. We need to talk more about it. We need to be with people that are in the same stage and work on it.
At your events, Gary, you speak to men who are in the stage already. Do you also speak to men who are approaching that stage of life?
Yeah, really, it is really funny. At first we were saying, well, it's kind of 50 or above, which is actually kind of early. But I've had a number of guys come to these fourth quarter events, and they're 45, and
wow.
They'll say, am I too young? And we'll just talk. And I'm really trying to gauge their heart. Are they looking toward the end of their life and what do they want to become and what do they want to leave and how do I prepare myself? And I'll say, absolutely, you come, and you'll be with other sages as you're becoming that. So
Good.
It's not really, as we've been saying, it's not really an age thing. It's more of a heart thing and where we are in our maturity, our walk with God. In fact, one of the things we're working towards is eventually want to start a community and maybe even doing some films on this of, you all remember the movie Legends of the Fall?
Sure.
So one of the things I'm playing with is I want to develop a community and some products called Legends of the Call.
Oh, wow.
Because I think that we should become Legends of the Call, walking that much more intently and in such a focused, powerful way in our calling, especially as we get older.
Sign me up.
Okay.
Put me on the list, man.
Yeah.
I'm ready.
Yeah.
You are a legend of the call already, Jim.
I don't know.
Yeah. For me, you guys are both legendary, and for so many others. So, Gary, where do people go if they're interested in talking with you or finding out more information about the fourth quarter events? Where would they go?
So you could simply go to thenobleheart.com and see what we have going there. You'll see a calendar and events list. Or really just simply email me at gary@thenobleheart.com.
All right.
And I'd love to interact on that.
Yeah, that's great, man. Well, I want to tell you both, as this is kind of weird, we're in a room, just the three of us, but I'll say this publicly because this goes out to thousands of listeners that we have, that you guys are both treasured and revered in my heart. And I love you both very dearly. And I am grateful to have you in my life as sages. And I'm learning more and more to engage with you in that way. It's so funny. You both recently, probably within the last couple of days, you've looked at either what's on my plate or what I'm doing. And you've both said, so how you doing? And immediately my response to that is, I really don't have time to tell you, so I'm just going to say, okay,
Just great.
So I need to engage more with when you guys ask that question. I'm just, publicly sharing that with you and with all of our listeners through now, who hopefully will help me be accountable. The other thing I want to tell you is I don't take it for granted. I don't take your relationship and your wisdom and your sageness in my life for granted. So I appreciate you guys and love you both.
Thanks, Scott.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So listeners, if you've got any questions, comments, if you want to engage with us on this conversation about the stages of masculinity or about the sage stage in particular, email us at exploringmore@zoe.org. And also, if you have a second while you're listening to us on iTunes, the vast majority of you listen to us on that platform, just leave us a review and also subscribe to our show. That helps us out immensely. Thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you, Gary and Jim, and we'll see you next week on Exploring More.
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of Exploring More. The landing page for this podcast is zoe.org/podcast. That's ZOWEH.org/podcast, where you can find the show notes and various platforms to which we broadcast. You can also find us and the Life of More by visiting Zoe on YouVersion Bible app, Right Now Media, our Facebook page, and Zoe on Instagram and Twitter. Remember, with God there is always more, and you were made for more.